Welcome back to the 240SX project. Today we'll be finishing the front brakes as well as doing the rear subframe. And here are the brakes. Like last time, they are painted. Just want to do a quick comparison. Now before putting on the brakes, you're going to want to make sure that you take off any leftover rust from the front face of the rotor from the last set of wheels that was on. And here's what it looks like afterwards with the brake caliper mount after its refresh. Now before I start bleeding the brakes, I'll add just a little bit of fluid because I know I'm going to lose a little bit through the process. I'm using dot 3 as this car can use dot 3 or dot 4. And the lines that I ordered were from ISR, and they're stainless steel coated lines. I also wanted to make sure that you use the bracket when you're mounting that on there. And then once it's on, you want to turn the steering wheel left to right, make sure the lines aren't catching or binding on anything. And then we'll put the wheel back on. And then once the wheel is on, we're going to make sure that the spokes aren't catching the caliper at all. And it looks like it's got plenty of clearance. Then we roll the car outside because I have a little more space out there, and out here I can go ahead and bleed the brakes without knocking anything over. And a quick view of what they look like. Now I use a cheap advanced auto vacuum pump to go ahead and bleed the brakes, pull all the air out. And then once everything is bled, I put the wheels on and I start torquing down somewhere between 80 to 85 foot-pound on the front wheels. And then you also want to make sure that your vehicle is chalked anytime you put it up in the air. And then next I'll finally start on the rear subframe install. Now I'll go ahead and remove the rear wheels since we have it up in the air. I like to carefully take them off without knocking the caliper or any of the studs on the wheels. And it's a 12 millimeter ratcheting wrench that I use to remove these. It does not take a lot of force at all, as you can tell. And then once it gets to the bottom of the coilover, I'll take a 17 mil, remove the nut, and the washer slides right out very easily. Just make sure you don't knock it around, take the paint off, or pop yourself in the face. Now, one thing you can notice here, what I have is I have an extra safety precaution, which is a wheel under the car. So that way, if the car decides it wants to slip off a jack, it'll catch the wheel. And then on the control arm, you'll notice that the bushings are rather shot. So we're putting on new control arms as well with this car. Now, other things with a much older car that will be shot will be the bushings on the rear sway bar, for example. And also the exhaust hanger looks like it ripped and he kind of just left it on there. So one of the first things I'll remove before I start the subframe will be the exhaust. As you know, a lot of people will mix match hardware all over, so just grab a couple of wrenches so you can have the right ones under the car. That way we have to crawl back out. The exhaust is fairly heavy. Make sure you don't tap your car on the way out. Now, as you work on this next part and you're disconnecting the drive shaft, you absolutely want to make sure that you have chocks on the front wheels because otherwise there's nothing stopping this car from rolling off the jack stand. So we have chocks, we have a wheel under the car, and just safety first as always. And then you want to thread these off by hand. Never use power tools in these portions. You don't want to strip the threads or flatten them out. And you want to take the drive shaft down, and I just like to rest it on a jack stand here so that way it doesn't slip off and pull the drive shaft out of the yoke. And at the axles here, you can see that this is a Texas car, so there was a lot of buildup on the hardware. So I'm going to use a 12 millimeter wrench, and I'm going to just tap off all the dirt, because if you don't, you do stand a chance to round this off if you can't get your wrench nice and snug onto the nuts and bolts here at the rear axles. So once all the dirt is off, I'm going to go ahead and take two 12 millimeter wrenches, and I'm going to start loosening and taking them off. And then once they're off, I like to put the nut and the bolt back together. That way I know to which ones they went with and I don't lose them. Now moving on towards the axles, you want to remove the cotter pin before you take out the axle nuts. Fairly hard to do if it's been on there for a while. And then take this little axle nut cover piece off. You can reuse that if you want. It is a 36 millimeter which you're going to use, so just buy one off eBay. They're fairly cheap. I have not had any issues with mine, no breaking or anything else. And there is a washer back here you want to make sure you pull out as well. Next, we move on to the rear brake caliper. Use a 17 millimeter wrench and start removing the mounting bolts that mount the caliper to the knuckle. And then take a zip tie and just hang it up from the area where your coilover used to hang out at. And now you have these little braces that are connected to your subframe to the body. There's going to be mix of 14 and 17 millimeter bolts and nuts around on these. So just make sure you have that with your tool set under the car as you go under. Same thing for your actual subframe nuts that you're going to pull off. Now with all the hardware removed, it's time to lower the subframe. I did leave the diff inside. I also left the sway bar attached. There are some pieces I do like to disconnect and some I like to leave on. The harder ones, such as the axle nuts and the axle hardware that connects to the diff flanges, I like to loosen up. That way I don't have to deal with it once it's on the ground, because you'll have to keep spinning the axles and you don't want this to spin on you while trying to loosen it up, because it'll make it rather difficult. And here is a picture of the entire subframe removed out of the car. And next couple of shots are going to be some of the tools you're going to want to have on you as you start to disassemble your subframe. Now the subframe I did end up tossing because it had some issues, and I just wanted to use some of the other parts that came off this car onto the S14 subframe. Now, as you start to remove parts from the subframe, you're going to want to be very careful and very deliberate about how you remove your hardware. Some of it you're going to want to reuse on your S14 subframe, not to mention with parts on the S chassis becoming a little more rare. You want to make sure that you can save a lot of these parts, keep in good condition, because they can be resold on the used market for a decent amount. And then you will see here the bushings on the subframe were also in fairly bad shape. I didn't have any interest in replacing them since I was tossing it. But here's the S14 subframe as we're about to put it onto the car. One of the things I like to do is take some hardware and I like to thread it onto the rear chassis studs just to make sure there's going to be no binding, to make sure the threads are in good condition. So that way, once I start putting the subframe in, I'm not going to have any issues. The subframe is extremely heavy, and it's kind of awkward when you're doing it as a one-person job, such as myself. So I will do this on all four of the studs. You're going to also have to do some clearancing for the S14 rear subframe onto the S13. This is under the rear seat area where I take a hammer and I just bang it out. Be careful of the brake lines, you don't want to hit them. Also here on the side, you're going to want to bang in another spot on the chassis to make the subframe clear. And then once I'm getting under the car, as again I mentioned earlier, it is very awkward to do this by yourself. Make sure you have that threaded hardware I showed you earlier. Make sure you have it handy, so that way as you get it slid onto the studs, you can start hand threading it on there. That'll help take away some of those weird balance points you're trying to do, because it's going to be pseudo mounted to the car, and then you can start focusing on all the other mounting points as you slowly push it up into the car. But be very careful. And once the subframe is on, again, there's more clearance you're going to have to do. So these auxiliary brackets we talked about earlier that we took off, you're going to have to bang in just the side right there of the car to get it to clear. Once you've done all your banging and clearance and you thread everything on, it looks great. My puppy hanging out with me at night. She gets a little sleepy. I'm out there for a while. So this is the rear diff that came off of the parts car, the S14 240SX. I was told it had a cause LSD inside, so I wanted to open it up and inspect it. And upon opening it, it's actually a TOMEI two-way LSD. I will take that as well. Now, once you're done inspecting everything and cleaning up the mating surfaces, you're going to put all the hardware back on and tighten the cover. Do kind of like a star, just as you would if you're mounting your wheel, a star cross pattern, if you will. And you want to make sure that this lays down evenly across the entire mounting surfaces of the rear diff. I also ordered some insane axles with a 500 horsepower rating. Why? Because the R154 I'm putting into this car will probably only do about 5 or 600 horsepower. So wanted to be moderate in the things that I bought. Also, here's a mix of all of these suspension components that came off between the S13 and S14 subframes. I'm going to just fit bits and pieces on, see how everything looks, how everything feels. I also check to make sure that the bushings are good. They are spherical bushings. Want to make sure there's not a lot of play. Also, there's going to be a difference between those rear toe arms, so you want to make sure you put the right one on that it fits. And then you're going to tighten down the subframe once you have everything mounted. And there are going to be 4 locations that I start with on the subframe itself with the main studs. And like most of us, Googling the next step for torque specs and whatnot. Just like the fronts, you're going to want to clean up the mating surfaces on the rear brakes. And as I put on the insane axles, I like to put a little bit of anti-seize on the splines before I slide everything in. And because I'm using S13 axles on an S14 subframe, I do have spacers. That way I can take up that extra space that you'll have, being the S14 use slightly longer axles and the S13 use slightly shorter axles. And here's everything mounted up. The axles are in, their axles are good, everything looks great. No issues. Then I'll slide the coilovers back on, again with the 17 millimeter nut that I took off earlier. And then I'll start to torque everything down. Now, unfortunately, there were some areas in which cross-threading happened prior to my ownership. So I ordered the appropriate size tap and die kits for all the areas that needed to be cleaned up within the subframe. And then after that, everything threaded in without any issues. You always want to make sure you don't force these things. Apply a little bit of oil when you start threading them in. Then when you pull them out, you're going to take your appropriate hardware that goes in that spot, thread it in by hand. Do not try and do it with any power tools or with any ratchets. Once that's good to go, you're going to put your washers back on over the axle area. And then you're going to go ahead and tighten down the hardware on your diff. Now, there are some areas within the diff in which you're going to be tightening down, whether it's the axles, the other portion of the drive shaft are going to be a little bit tight. You're not going to be able to fit your tools, so just get it good and tight. Now, again, there are more areas that I found again, particularly the sway bar mounting points that needed to be threaded. So, again, try not to use any ratchets and try to do this by hand, no power tools. You do not want to make it worse. Now, honestly, with any time you're going to be mounting any kind of hardware, I do generally like to always do everything by hand first, make sure it gets fitted on, make sure there's no binding, make sure there's no cross-threading, and obviously do this after you've done a visual inspection too. You want to visually inspect your threads before you start putting everything on. So you start putting it in by hand, and then afterwards you can go ahead and pull out, whether it be a torque wrench or a wrench. There isn't a whole lot of force that's needed for this hardware here on the sway bar end links point. And there it is, all fitted on nicely. No fuss. And a top view for you as well to see what it looks like before I torque everything down. And then the sway bar mount points as well. You want to go ahead and tighten these down too after you've already cleaned up the threads. Now I did get new rotors for the rear because the rear rotors that were on the car were some not so well remanufactured pieces, so I wanted to get some nice new pieces. Spray the calipers. I did try to bring out the logo there by sanding it. It did not turn well, so I just sprayed back over it. But this is everything when it's all said and done. It looks great. Can't wait to drive it.